The scream came before the introduction. Clara Whitmore had barely set her traveling case down on the marble floor of Ashcombe Hall when a man's voice tore through the quiet entrance hall, sharp and furious, demanding to know who had let her inside. She turned, startled, expecting a servant, perhaps a butler annoyed by an unswept step. Instead, she found herself facing a tall man with dark eyes and a face drawn tight with something close to horror, striding toward her so quickly that she stepped back without meaning to. He stopped an arm's length away and stood very still, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. His nostrils flared. His jaw tightened. For a moment he said nothing at all, and the silence stretched so long that Clara wondered if she had done something terribly wrong simply by breathing. "Where did you get that scent?" he said at last. His voice was low, controlled, but shaking underneath. Clara blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "The perfume." He took a step closer, and she caught the flicker of something raw behind his anger, something that looked almost like grief. "Tell me where you got it, now." She had worn it that morning, without thinking twice. A small dab from a glass vial that had belonged to her mother, kept in a wooden box since childhood. It was the only extravagance she owned, the only thing of her mother's that still smelled like her. Faint traces of rose and something warmer underneath, like sun on old wood. "It was my mother's," Clara said carefully. "I don't understand why that concerns you, sir." "I am not, sir," he said. "I am the Duke of Ashcombe, and that is my mother's perfume. She has been dead for 11 years. No one has worn it since, because no one else in England has it. It was made once, for her alone." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, spreading out in slow, cold rings. Clara felt her pulse quicken. She had come to Ashcombe Hall on the strength of a letter, hired as a companion to the Duke's aging aunt, a position arranged through an agency in London, with no mention of dukes or dead duchesses or perfumes that belonged to no one but the dead. "I have never met your mother," she said. "I did not know her name until this moment. I don't understand how this is possible." He studied her face, as though searching for a lie hidden somewhere in it. Whatever he found, or failed to find, seemed to unsettle him further. Behind him, a housekeeper in gray had appeared in the doorway, her hand pressed to her chest, her face gone the color of chalk. She was staring at Clara too, though not with anger, with something closer to fear. "Mrs. Prentice," the Duke said without turning. "Did you know about this?" The housekeeper did not answer right away. When she did, her voice came out thin and careful. "Your Grace, I think it would be wise to speak somewhere private. Answer the question." "I did not know," Mrs. Prentice said, though her eyes did not quite meet his, and Clara, watching closely despite her own confusion, thought she saw a flicker of something else beneath the housekeeper's words. A held breath, a door quietly shutting on something larger. The Duke turned back to Clara. Up close, she could see the shadows beneath his eyes, the tightness at his temples, the look of a man who had not slept properly in a very long time. "You will come with me," he said. "Both of you." It was not a request. Clara followed him down a long corridor lined with paintings of stern ancestors, their eyes seeming to track her as she passed. Mrs. Prentice walked close behind, close enough that Clara could hear her breathing, quick and shallow. They passed through a set of double doors into a study lined floor to ceiling with books, a fire burning low in the grate despite the mild afternoon, and the Duke shut the doors behind them with a heavy click. "Sit," he said, gesturing to a chair, though he himself remained standing, pacing near the window like a man trying to outwalk his own thoughts. Clara sat, her hands folded themselves in her lap out of old habit, the posture of a woman trained since girlhood to appear calm even when her heart was pounding. "Your Grace, I came here to care for your aunt. I know nothing of your mother, or her perfume, or why my presence has caused such alarm. If I have offended you, I am sorry for it, though I confess I do not understand how." "You have not offended me." He stopped pacing and faced her fully. "You have frightened me, which is a different thing entirely, and one I am not accustomed to feeling in my own home." "Frightened you?" "My mother died in this house 11 years ago. The circumstances were never fully explained to me, though I was told it was an accident, a fall, nothing more. I was young. I accepted it because there seemed no reason not to. But there has always been a part of this house that feels unfinished, as though a door was shut too quickly, and never properly closed." He glanced at Mrs. Prentice, who stood very still near the doorway, her hands twisted together in front of her apron. "And now a stranger walks into my hall wearing a scent that belonged only to her, a scent no chemist in London could reproduce because the formula was destroyed the week she died." Clara felt the floor of her understanding shift beneath her. "Destroyed by whom?" "That," the Duke said quietly, Is what I intend to find out. He turned to Mrs. Prentice. You have served this house for over 30 years. You knew my mother better than anyone left alive under this roof. I want the truth, and I want it now. Did you know this perfume still existed anywhere in England? Before that conversation could take place, Clara spent a restless morning trying to occupy herself with ordinary duties, reading aloud to Lady Beatrice from a novel neither of them was truly following, both women's minds clearly elsewhere. Lady Beatrice finally set down her needlework with an impatient sigh and fixed Clara with a shrewd, appraising look. You are hardly listening to a word of this story, she said. Nor am I, if I am honest. Tell me plainly, child, what troubles you this morning? Clara hesitated, uncertain how much she was permitted to share, but something in the old woman's steady gaze invited honesty rather than caution. I keep thinking of my mother, she admitted, trying to remember anything at all from my childhood that might explain what I have learned since arriving here. There is so little. She rarely spoke of her past, and when she did, it was always vague, always brief, as though she were choosing her words with great care even in casual conversation. Grief does that to people, Lady Beatrice said, though her tone suggested she did not entirely believe her own explanation applied here. But so does fear. I have seen both in my long life, and they do not always look so different from the outside. She reached over and patted Clara's hand gently. Whatever you find in this house, my dear, know that you are not required to carry it alone, however alone your mother may have felt in her own time. The kindness in the old woman's words settled something anxious in Clara's chest, and she found herself, later that same morning, seeking out Mrs. Prentice with renewed resolve, determined finally to ask the questions she had been too hesitant to voice since her arrival. Mrs. Prentice's composure, which had held through the corridor and the long walk to the study, finally began to crack. Her lips trembled before she spoke. There was a girl, she said, a maid, many years ago, before you were born, Your Grace. No, forgive me, when you were still a small child. She worked closely with your mother. Closer than most servants ever worked with their mistress. I always believed the Duchess trusted her with things she trusted no one else. What things? I don't know, Your Grace. I was young myself then, and it was not my place to ask questions above my station. Her eyes flicked toward Clara, quick and uneasy. But I remember the girl's name was Margaret Coyle. The name struck Clara like a slap. That was my mother's name, she said, her voice suddenly unsteady. My mother was Margaret Coyle. The room went very quiet. Even the fire seemed to hold its crackle. The Duke's expression shifted from suspicion to something far more complicated, something between disbelief and the dawning shape of an idea he did not yet want to accept. Your mother, he said slowly, worked in this house. I don't know that, Clara said, though even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into them. My mother never once mentioned Ashcombe Hall. She never spoke of working in service at all. She raised me in a small cottage 2 counties away, and she died when I was 17, and she left me almost nothing except that perfume and a handful of old letters I never fully understood. Letters, the Duke repeated, and something sharpened in his eyes, the look of a hunter catching a scent of his own. What letters? I don't know what they mean. They are old, and the ink is faded, and I never thought them important enough to study closely. They mentioned no names I recognized. Until today. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and stopped in front of her chair, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Miss Whitmore, I need to see those letters. They are in London, in a trunk with the rest of my mother's belongings. I did not bring them with me. I did not think I would need them. Then you will send for them, he said, tonight. Mrs. Prentice made a small sound near the door, something caught between a protest and a plea, but when the Duke turned to look at her, she pressed her lips shut and said nothing further. Clara studied the housekeeper's face and saw, unmistakably now, that the woman knew far more than she was willing to say. There was fear there, old and deeply rooted, the kind that came not from a stranger's arrival, but from a truth kept buried for over a decade, and buried, Clara suspected, for good reason. Your Grace, Clara said carefully, if my mother once worked in this house, and if she knew your mother, then I have as much right to understand what happened here as you do, more perhaps, since it seems her name has been carried in silence long enough. Something in his expression eased, just slightly, as though her words had struck a chord he had not expected a stranger to reach. Then we will find out together, he said, starting with the letters. He turned to Mrs. Prentice. I want the household perfumer's old ledgers brought to me by morning. Every record from the year my mother died, and I want to know who else remembers Margaret Coyle. Mrs. Prentice curtsied stiffly, her face pale, and left the room without a word, though Clara noticed the slight tremor in her hands as the door closed behind her. Alone with the Duke now, Clara felt the full strangeness of the moment settle over her. Hours ago she had been a woman seeking quiet employment, a companion to an elderly aunt, nothing more. Now she sat in the study of a Duke who believed she carried the scent of his dead mother on her skin, and the name of her own mother had just been spoken aloud in this house for what felt like the first time in years. "I did not come here to disturb anything," she said quietly. "I believe you," the Duke said, and for the first time since she had arrived, his voice softened. "But you have disturbed it all the same, and I think, Miss Whitmore, that whatever happened in this house 11 years ago did not end the way I was told it did." Outside the window, the afternoon light had begun to fade, throwing long shadows across the lawn, and somewhere deep in the house a clock struck the hour, slow and heavy, as though counting down to something neither of them yet understood. Clara looked down at her own wrist, where the faint scent still lingered, sweet and warm and utterly foreign to her now, a fragrance that had once felt like the last piece of her mother she had left, and now felt like the first thread of a mystery she had not known she was walking into. "Send the letter tonight," the Duke said again, quieter this time. "Whatever is written in those pages, I intend to know it before the week is out." Clara nodded slowly, her mind already racing ahead to the trunk in her old lodgings, to the faded ink she had never bothered to read closely, to a mother who had apparently kept far more secrets than her daughter had ever imagined. "I will write to my landlady tonight," she said. "The letters will come." The Duke held her gaze a moment longer, as though trying to read something in her face that even she did not yet know was there, and then he turned toward the window, his silhouette dark against the fading light, a man standing at the edge of a truth he had spent 11 years avoiding, and was now, whether he wished it or not, about to face. Clara rose from her chair, her legs unsteady beneath her, and walked to the door. As she reached for the handle, his voice stopped her one last time. "Miss Whitmore." She turned. "Whatever we find," he said, "I do not believe it will be simple." "No," Clara said softly, thinking of her mother's quiet life, her sudden silences, the way she had flinched whenever anyone asked about her past. "I don't believe it will be either." She stepped out into the corridor, the portraits watching her pass once more, and somewhere behind her, in the study, she heard the Duke's low, steady breathing, a man bracing himself for whatever the coming days would bring. The house around her felt different now than it had an hour before. The halls seemed longer, the shadows deeper, every closed door a possible answer waiting behind it. She walked slowly toward the small room she had been given near the servants' quarters, her fingers brushing absently against the wrist where the perfume still lingered, and for the first time in her life, she wondered if her quiet, careful mother had once walked these very same halls, carrying secrets Clara was only now beginning to uncover. The candle in her room burned low that night as she sat by the window, staring out at the dark gardens of Ashcombe Hall, her mind turning over every fragment of memory she had of her mother, searching for some clue she might have missed. Somewhere in London, a trunk full of old letters waited to be opened, and somewhere in this house, a housekeeper carried a secret she was clearly terrified to speak aloud. Clara did not sleep that night. She sat awake instead, watching the moon rise over the grounds of a house she had entered as a stranger, and now feared she might never fully leave, not until she understood exactly why a Duke's mother's perfume had found its way onto her skin, and what her own mother had truly been to this family so many years before. The letter went out with the morning post, carried by a groom named Peter who rode hard for the village to catch the early coach to London. Clara watched him disappear down the long gravel drive from her window, and only then did she allow herself to breathe properly for the first time since the previous afternoon. Breakfast in the servants' hall was a quiet, watchful affair. Word had clearly spread overnight, though no one spoke of it directly. A young maid named Lucy kept glancing at Clara across the table, curious and a little wary, as though Clara might be something dangerous wrapped in an ordinary dress. An older footman named Samuel avoided her eyes altogether, busying himself with the teapot far longer than necessary. Only Mrs. Prentice seemed entirely unchanged, moving through her duties with the same brisk efficiency as always, though Clara noticed the housekeeper's hands trembled slightly whenever she thought no one was watching. After breakfast, Clara was summoned again to the study, this time to find not only the Duke but an elderly woman seated near the fire, wrapped in shawls despite the warmth of the room. This, Clara realized, must be Lady Beatrice, the aunt she had actually been hired to attend. "So this is the girl," Lady Beatrice said, studying Clara over the rim of her spectacles. Her voice was thin but sharp, missing nothing. The one wearing my sister-in-law's perfume. Yes, my lady, Clara said, curtsying carefully. Strange business. Lady Beatrice's gaze lingered on her a moment longer before shifting to her nephew. Julian, you look as though you haven't slept. I haven't, the Duke admitted. He stood near his desk, a stack of old leather-bound ledgers piled in front of him, clearly retrieved overnight from wherever they had been stored. Mrs. Prentice found the household perfumer's records. I want Miss Whitmore to see them. He opened the top ledger and turned it toward Clara, pointing to a page dated some 14 years earlier. The handwriting was elegant, looping, clearly the work of a trained clerk. It listed an order placed by the Duchess Eleanor Ashford for a custom fragrance, the ingredients recorded in painstaking detail: rose absolute, sandalwood, a rare amber resin imported at considerable expense. Beside the entry, a note in different ink read, "Formula to be destroyed upon completion of final order, no copies to remain." Why would she order something destroyed the moment it was finished? Clara asked. I don't know, the Duke said, but there is a second entry, 3 years later, for a smaller batch. Delivered not to my mother, but to a household maid. No name is given, only an initial, the letter M. Clara felt her chest tighten. You believe that maid was my mother? I believe it is possible, he said carefully, which raises a question I cannot answer. Why would my mother give her own private perfume, a fragrance destroyed and never remade for anyone else, to a servant in her household? Lady Beatrice made a small, thoughtful sound from her chair by the fire. I remember a girl, she said slowly, quiet thing, very devoted to Eleanor. Followed her about like a shadow those last few years. I never thought much of it at the time. Servants often grow attached to a kind mistress, but now that I think on it, there was something unusual in how close they were. Eleanor trusted her with things she trusted no one else, not even her own husband, God rest him. Do you remember her name? Clara asked, though she already feared she knew the answer. Margaret, Lady Beatrice said. Yes, Margaret, that was it. A gentle sort of name for a gentle sort of girl, though I recall she left rather suddenly, not long after Eleanor's death. No one gave much explanation, servants come and go, and in the grief of that time I did not think to ask questions I perhaps should have asked. Clara sat very still, absorbing the weight of what she was hearing. Her mother, quiet, careful, always slightly guarded, had been more than a servant in this house. She had been trusted, chosen, given something precious enough that its formula had been destroyed to keep it hers alone, and then, apparently, given to someone else entirely. There is something else, the Duke said, turning to another page in the ledger. A payment record dated the same week as my mother's death. A sum of money, quite substantial, paid out to a Miss M. Coyle, described only as severance for services rendered. Severance, Clara repeated, as though she was dismissed. Or paid to leave, the Duke said quietly, and never come back. The room fell silent. Even Lady Beatrice, usually so quick with an opinion, said nothing for a long moment, her eyes fixed thoughtfully on the fire. Clara found herself staring at the neat columns of figures in the ledger, the careful clerk's hand recording a sum of money that had likely represented more security than her mother had ever known before or after. Enough perhaps to secure the small cottage where Clara herself had grown up. Enough to explain the modest but steady comfort of her childhood, despite her mother's lack of any obvious trade or income. She had never questioned as a girl where the money for their quiet life had come from, simply accepting the small comforts of home as any child does, without curiosity for their origin. Now she understood, with a fresh pang of sorrow, that every meal, every warm winter coat, every small kindness her mother had been able to provide, had likely been purchased with the price of her silence, a debt paid in comfort for a truth withheld. She never spent it foolishly, Clara said quietly, almost to herself. She was always careful, always modest in her wants, though we never lacked for anything essential. I always believed it was simply her nature to live plainly. Now I wonder if she simply could never bring herself to enjoy money that had cost her so much to accept. Lady Beatrice reached over and squeezed her hand gently, no words necessary, and the Duke, watching the exchange, felt his own resolve harden further, a fresh determination settling over his features to see the matter through to whatever conclusion the truth required, however painful that conclusion might prove for his own family's name. Your Grace, Clara said at last, choosing her words with care, if my mother was paid to leave this house immediately after your mother's death, then either she left because she wished to, grieving the loss of a woman she cared for, or she left because someone wanted her gone, and quickly, before she could speak of something she had seen. The Duke's eyes met hers, and she saw in them the same thought that had already taken root in her own mind. You believe she witnessed something. I believe it is possible, Clara said, echoing his own careful words back to him. I have spent all night trying to remember anything my mother ever said about this house, and I confess there is very little. She rarely spoke of her past at all. When I asked, as children do, she would grow quiet and change the subject, and eventually I learned not to ask. I always believed it was simple sorrow, the kind that makes people avoid old wounds. Now I wonder if it was something closer to fear. Lady Beatrice shifted in her chair, drawing her shawl tighter despite the warmth of the fire. There was talk, at the time, she said slowly, as though dragging the memory up from somewhere long buried. Not from the family, of course. One does not discuss such things openly, but among the staff, whispers that Eleanor's fall was not entirely an accident, that someone had been in the East Tower with her that evening, and left before the household was alerted. Who? The Duke asked, his voice tight. I never learned a name, Lady Beatrice said. It was all rumor, the kind that spreads through servants' halls and dies quickly when no one dares repeat it to the family directly. I dismissed it at the time as grief-talking, people needing someone to blame when a death makes no sense to them, but perhaps I was wrong to dismiss it so easily. Clara thought of the letters waiting in her trunk in London, the faded ink she had never bothered to study, and felt a fresh urgency rise in her chest. Whatever her mother had known, whatever she had seen in the final hours of Eleanor Ashford's life, it might be written there, waiting all these years for someone to finally read it properly. The letters will arrive within the week, she said. I believe they may hold answers none of us have yet considered. The Duke closed the ledger slowly, his expression unreadable, though Clara could see the tension in the set of his shoulders, the careful control of a man forcing himself to remain calm in the face of a truth that threatened to unravel everything he thought he understood about his own family. Until then, he said, I want no one else told of this, not the staff, not visitors, no one. If someone in this house had reason to want my mother's death left unexamined, I do not wish to give them warning that the examination has begun. You suspect someone still living here, Clara said. I suspect, the Duke said carefully, that very little in this house has changed in 11 years. The same staff largely, the same family. My Uncle Edmund visits regularly, and has taken a keen interest in the estate's affairs since my mother's death, an interest I confess I never questioned until this morning. He paused, choosing his next words with visible care. I do not accuse anyone yet, but I intend to ask questions, and I would rather ask them quietly, before whoever holds the answers has reason to hide them further. Lady Beatrice reached out and patted Clara's hand where it rested on the arm of her chair, an unexpectedly gentle gesture from a woman who had greeted her with such sharp suspicion only minutes before. You have walked into something larger than you knew, my dear, she said, but I do not think it an accident that you came here wearing that scent. Fate has a strange way of returning what was buried. Clara did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, though the words settled into her chest and stayed there for the rest of the day, following her through her duties, through the quiet corridors of Ashcombe Hall, through the long hours of waiting for a letter that could not arrive quickly enough. That evening, as she passed the east wing of the house on her way to check on Lady Beatrice, Clara noticed a narrow staircase she had not seen before, half hidden behind a heavy curtain, leading upward into darkness. She paused, her hand resting on the curtain's edge, curiosity pulling at her despite the late hour and her own better judgment. She thought of the small drawing she had found tucked between her mother's letters, the child's stick figure sketched in faded pencil, and wondered now whether it had been drawn by the young Duke himself, a boy of 6 or 7 sitting patiently while a kind maid minded him during long afternoons when his own mother was occupied with the endless demands of running a great estate. It was a strange thought that her mother might have once held this very man's small hand, guided his fingers across a page, hummed some old song to quiet him during a thunderstorm. Clara had grown up believing her mother's life before her own birth to be a blank and uneventful thing, a plain cottage existence stretching backward into nothing of consequence. Now every hour seemed to reveal another layer she had never suspected, another version of Margaret Coyle that Clara had never been permitted to know. She had spent the earlier part of the evening walking the lower gardens with Lucy, the young maid who had watched her so warily at breakfast that first morning, but had since warmed considerably, chattering easily about the small dramas of life below stairs, who was courting whom among the stable hands, which cook had burned the pastry that week and blamed the ovens rather than her own distraction. It was ordinary talk, comforting in its smallness, and Clara had welcomed it as a brief escape from the weight pressing down on her since her arrival. But even there, in the midst of easy conversation, Lucy had let slip a small detail that lodged itself in Clara's mind and refused to loosen. My mother worked here too in the old days, Lucy had said, pulling a stray thread from her apron without much thought. She always said the year the old Duchess died was the strangest year this house ever saw. Said half the staff walked around for months afterward, like they were waiting for something terrible to happen again, though nothing ever did, not that anyone spoke of. She had shrugged then, moving on to some lighter subject, unaware of how deeply her casual words had struck the woman walking beside her. Clara had said nothing in response, only nodded, and let the conversation drift elsewhere, but the phrase stayed with her long after they parted ways near the kitchen entrance. Waiting for something terrible to happen again. It was the language of people who suspected far more than they dared voice aloud. An entire household holding its breath together for years, bound by unspoken fear rather than shared understanding. It was with these thoughts still turning in her mind that Clara had found herself standing before the curtained staircase in the east wing that evening, drawn by nothing more than instinct and the restless, unanswered questions gathering weight inside her. "That staircase leads to the old tower," the voice said. "It has been locked for years. I would advise you not to go wandering where you do not belong, Miss Whitmore." Clara turned to find a man she did not recognize standing a few feet away, tall and silver-haired, dressed in the fine clothes of a gentleman rather than a servant. His eyes were pale and watchful, and something in his tone, polite on the surface, carried an unmistakable edge of warning underneath. "Forgive me," Clara said carefully. "I did not mean to intrude. I don't believe we've been introduced." "Edmund Ashford," the man said, offering a small formal bow that did not reach his eyes. "The Duke's uncle. And you, I understand, are the young woman causing quite a stir in this house." "I did not intend to cause any stir at all, sir." "No," Edmund said, his gaze drifting briefly, deliberately, to the curtain behind her. "I imagine you did not. And yet here we are." He offered a thin smile that did nothing to warm his expression. "A word of advice, Miss Whitmore. Old houses hold old griefs. It is often kinder, to everyone, to let them lie undisturbed." He turned and walked away without waiting for a reply, his footsteps echoing down the corridor until they faded into silence, leaving Clara standing alone before the curtained staircase, her heart beating fast, absolutely certain now that whatever truth lay buried in this house, Edmund Ashford did not wish for it to be found. Clara did not sleep well after her encounter with Edmund Ashford. She lay awake turning his words over in her mind, the smoothness of his voice, the warning wrapped so carefully in courtesy that it had taken her several minutes afterward to recognize it fully for what it was. Old houses hold old griefs. It was kinder to let them lie undisturbed. She thought of her mother's silences, the same careful avoidance dressed in gentler clothing, and wondered how many people in her life had used kindness as a way of keeping the truth locked away. The next morning, she found Mrs. Prentice alone in the linen room, folding sheets with quick, practiced hands, and Clara seized the opportunity before her courage could fail her. "Mrs. Prentice," she said, closing the door softly behind her, "I think you know more than you have said." The housekeeper's hands stilled over the linens. For a long moment she did not turn around. "Miss Whitmore, it is not my place to speak of things above my station. Your place," Clara said gently, "seems to have kept you frightened for 11 years. I do not think that is a comfortable place to stand." Mrs. Prentice turned then, and Clara saw that her eyes were wet, though she blinked the tears back quickly, straightening her spine the way women do when they have spent a lifetime refusing to let anyone see them break. "You do not understand what you are asking me to risk." "Then help me understand," Clara said. "Please, my mother is dead. She cannot speak for herself. If you knew her, if you cared for her at all, then you know she deserves to have her name spoken honestly, whatever the truth turns out to be." Something in Clara's voice seemed to reach the older woman. Mrs. Prentice set down the sheet she was holding and sank slowly onto a low stool near the shelves, her hands folding in her lap, her shoulders bowed under the weight of something long carried alone. "Your mother was the sweetest girl I ever knew in service," she said quietly. "Gentle, careful. She came to Ashcombe as a scullery maid, barely 16, and within 2 years, the Duchess had taken a particular liking to her, promoted her to lady's maid, kept her close at all hours. Some of the older staff grumbled about favoritism, but I never minded it. Margaret earned that trust. She was loyal in a way few servants ever are." "What happened the night the Duchess died?" Mrs. Prentice's hands tightened in her lap. "I do not know everything. I was not there. But I know your mother was the last person seen entering the East Tower that evening, and I know she was gone from this house within 3 days of the funeral, without so much as a proper goodbye to the staff who had known her for years. That is not how a beloved servant leaves a household she has served faithfully. That is how someone leaves when they are frightened, or when they have been told to go. Told by whom? Mrs. Prentice glanced toward the closed door, as though afraid the walls themselves might carry her words further than she intended. I saw Mr. Edmund speaking with her the morning after the Duchess's death, she whispered. In the garden, where they thought no one would see. Your mother was crying. He was not unkind in his manner, from what I could observe at a distance, but he pressed something into her hand, a purse I believe, and she left the following week. You believe he paid her to leave? I believe, Mrs. Prentice said carefully, that whatever happened in that tower, Mr. Edmund did not want it spoken of, and your mother was persuaded, one way or another, that silence was safer than speech. Clara absorbed this slowly, feeling the pieces of a puzzle she had not known existed begin, painfully, to align. Do you believe he harmed the Duchess? I do not know, Mrs. Prentice said, and for the first time her voice cracked entirely. I have wondered it for 11 years and never dared say it aloud, not even to myself in the quiet of my own room. Eleanor Ashford was kind to everyone below stairs, kinder than most of her rank ever bothered to be, and her death broke something in this house that has never properly healed. If Mr. Edmund had a hand in it, I could not prove it, and to accuse a man of his standing without proof would have meant losing my position, perhaps far worse. But you believe it enough to have been frightened all this time. Mrs. Prentice met her eyes then, and the fear there was unmistakable. I believe, Miss Whitmore, that you should be very careful. If your mother saw something that night worth paying to keep silent, and if you have now walked back into this house wearing the very perfume that ties you to her, then you have made yourself a piece on a board you do not yet understand, and there are players on it who have had 11 years to prepare for someone like you to arrive. The warning settled cold in Clara's chest. She thanked Mrs. Prentice quietly, promising to keep what she had shared in confidence, and left the linen room with her mind racing far ahead of her feet. She thanked Mrs. Prentice quietly and stepped back out into the corridor, her thoughts churning so violently that she nearly collided with a young stable boy hurrying past with a message for the kitchen. He apologized quickly and darted onward, and Clara stood for a moment simply breathing, trying to steady herself before she went in search of the Duke. The house felt different to her now than it had even an hour before, every corridor seeming to hold some fresh possibility of hidden history, every closed door a question she had not yet thought to ask. She thought of Edmund Ashford's warning from the previous evening, the careful courtesy wrapped around something far colder underneath, and found herself walking more cautiously than usual, glancing over her shoulder at the empty hall behind her, though she could not have said exactly what she expected to find there. It occurred to her, with an unpleasant jolt, that if her suspicion about the tower and the man who had truly been present that night proved correct, then she herself might now represent a danger to someone who had spent over a decade believing his secret safely buried. The thought was not comforting, but it hardened her resolve rather than weakening it. Her mother had lived in fear for years. Clara did not intend to inherit that same fear without at least first attempting to understand its cause. She found the Duke in the stables that afternoon, examining a mare's injured foreleg with the quiet focus of a man trying to lose himself in ordinary work. He straightened when he saw her approach, reading something urgent in her expression before she had even spoken. "You've learned something," he said. Clara told him everything Mrs. Prentice had shared, watching his face harden with each detail, his jaw setting into a grim, controlled line that reminded her, briefly, of how he had looked the very first moment they met. "My uncle has always claimed my mother's death was a tragic accident," he said when she finished. "He was the one who first suggested I not press for further inquiry at the time, insisting it would only prolong the family's grief. I was 15. I trusted him completely. He had been like a second father to me since my own father's death 2 years before. Perhaps he believed he was protecting you," Clara offered, though even as she said it, she did not fully believe her own words. "Perhaps," the Duke said, though his tone made clear he found the explanation thin. "Or perhaps he was protecting himself." He set down the mare's hoof gently and straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth hanging from a nearby hook. "I want to see the tower. Mrs. Prentice said it has been locked for years." "I am the Duke of Ashcombe," he said, a faint, humorless smile touching his mouth. "I have the key to every locked door in this house." They climbed the narrow staircase together that evening, after the household had settled for the night, candles in hand, the old stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. The air grew colder as they climbed, thick with dust and the particular silence of a room long undisturbed. At the top, the Duke unlocked a heavy oak door with a key he had retrieved from a hidden drawer in his study, and it swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire house. The room beyond was exactly as it must have been left 11 years before, a lady's private sitting room, Furniture draped in white sheets, a writing desk still holding an inkwell long since dried to nothing. Clara moved through it slowly, her candle throwing trembling shadows across the walls, and felt a strange, aching sense of intrusion, as though she were walking through the final private moments of a woman she had never known but somehow felt tied to. A small writing box sat open on a side table, untouched for over a decade, its contents undisturbed, a half-finished letter still resting inside. The ink long faded to a pale brown that was barely legible. Clara did not touch it, though her fingers hovered near it for a long moment, some instinct warning her that whatever words remained there belonged to a private grief not fully hers to read. A bookshelf along the far wall held a small collection of well-worn novels, their spines cracked from repeated reading, and tucked among them, Clara noticed a slim volume of poetry with a faded ribbon marking a particular page. She lifted it carefully and found the poem marked to be one of quiet longing, verses about a mother's love for a child she feared she might not see grow to adulthood, and something about the choice of that particular page, worn soft from frequent reopening, struck Clara as unbearably sad, a woman perhaps sensing some shadow over her own future long before that final evening in the tower. She loved to read, the Duke said quietly, watching Clara study the small volume. I remember that much clearly, even after all these years. She would read for hours by that window, and sometimes she would read aloud to me, though I was often too restless as a boy to sit still for very long. He allowed himself a small, sad smile. I wish now that I had sat still more often. Clara returned the book gently to its place on the shelf and moved deeper into the room, toward a small portrait hanging above the cold hearth, half hidden beneath a protective sheet. She lifted the corner of the fabric carefully and found herself looking into the painted face of Eleanor Ashford herself, dark-eyed and gentle-featured, her expression caught somewhere between amusement and thoughtfulness, as though the artist had captured her mid-conversation rather than posed in formal stillness. She looks kind, Clara said softly. She was, the Duke said, moving to stand beside her, his eyes fixed on the portrait with an expression Clara could not quite name. Grief and tenderness intertwined so closely, they seemed inseparable. Kinder than most in her position ever bothered to be. It is, I think, why the staff below stairs remember her so fondly even now, why your mother trusted her enough to keep her private counsel for those difficult final months. This was her favorite room, the Duke said quietly, his voice unusually soft. She used to bring me up here as a boy, when my father was too busy with estate matters to notice I had gone missing for an afternoon. She would read to me by that window. Clara's eyes drifted to the window he indicated, a tall arched pane overlooking the gardens below, and then, almost without meaning to the low stone ledge beneath it, worn smooth in places, faintly discolored in a way that made her chest tighten with sudden, unwanted understanding. Julian, she said softly, using his given name for the first time without quite realizing she had done so. Is that where she fell? He followed her gaze and went very still. Yes, he said, that is what I was told. Clara approached the window slowly and looked down at the sheer drop to the stone terrace far below, then back at the ledge itself, low enough that a grown woman would have had to be pushed, or badly startled to fall from it by accident. She said nothing, but she saw the same calculation reflected in the Duke's face, the same cold arithmetic of doubt. If someone else was here that night, she said carefully, and if my mother saw it happen, then her silence was not cowardice. It was survival. The Duke turned from the window, his expression suddenly, fiercely determined. Then we will find the proof that frees her from that silence at last, whatever it costs. They lingered a while longer in the quiet room, neither quite ready to leave the fragile intimacy that had settled between them amid the dust and the draped furniture. The Duke moved slowly to the writing desk and studied the dried inkwell, the small collection of quills laid neatly beside it, untouched for over a decade. I used to imagine, as a boy, that if I simply refused to accept she was gone, some part of her might remain, he admitted quietly, not quite looking at Clara as he spoke. I would come up here sometimes, before the door was locked for good, and sit in her chair, and pretend she had only stepped out for a moment, and would return shortly to finish whatever letter she had been writing. It was a foolish habit for a boy nearly grown, but grief makes fools of all of us for a time. It is not foolish, Clara said gently. It sounds like love, looking for somewhere to rest. He glanced at her then, something grateful in his expression, as though her words had eased a small, old shame he had carried without realizing it. You have a gift for finding kindness in places others might only see weakness, he said. I do not think that is a common thing. My mother taught me that, Clara said softly, Even in her silences, she was always kind. I understand now that her kindness cost her more than I ever knew, but she never let that cost turn her bitter. Not once, not in all the years I knew her. They stood together a moment longer in the hush of the old room, the candlelight flickering gently against the draped furniture, and Clara felt, for the first time since her arrival, a strange and unexpected sense of belonging settle over her, as though this room, once a place of sorrow, might slowly be reclaimed as something gentler. As they made their way back down the narrow staircase, candles guttering in the draught, Clara heard, or thought she heard, the faint sound of a door closing somewhere below them, quiet and careful, the sound of someone who did not wish to be caught listening. She said nothing to the Duke, not wanting to alarm him further that night, but the sound followed her all the way back to her room, and she lay awake long after, certain now that someone in this house had been watching their every move. The letters arrived 4 days later, carried up the drive in a small trunk by a coachman Clara had never met, sent by her landlady in London with a short note wishing her well. Clara's hands shook as she lifted the trunk's lid, the familiar smell of old paper and cedar rising up to meet her, so achingly like her mother that for a moment she could not bring herself to reach inside. She carried the bundle of letters to the study, where the Duke waited, and together they spread them across his desk, dozens of pages in her mother's careful looping hand, some dated, some not, spanning what appeared to be several years. Most were ordinary, small domestic notes, records of household purchases, a recipe for lavender water, a child's drawing tucked between 2 pages that made Clara's throat tighten unexpectedly, though she did not recognize the small stick figure sketched there. Clara lingered over several of the ordinary letters longer than she needed to, unable to resist the small, private glimpses they offered into a mother she had thought she knew completely. One described a spring morning spent picking wildflowers along a hedgerow, written in a light, almost girlish hand quite unlike the careful, measured tone Clara remembered from her mother's later years. Another mentioned a small kindness done for her by someone referred to only as the mistress, a warm coat gifted before a hard winter, described with such evident gratitude that Clara felt her throat tighten reading it. She had known her mother as a quiet, careful woman, always slightly guarded, always watching the door as though expecting some visitor who never came. These letters revealed a younger self entirely, warmer, more open, a woman who had once trusted easily and loved her position in this grand house without reservation, before something had changed that trust into permanent caution. The Duke, sorting through his own portion of the bundle, paused over a page and held it up. "This one mentions my mother directly," he said. "Nothing troubling, only an account of an afternoon spent walking the grounds together, my mother apparently teaching yours to identify the different varieties of roses along the south wall." He set it down gently, something wistful crossing his features. "She writes of her with such obvious affection. Whatever came later, I do not think that friendship, if I may call it that, across such a difference in station, was ever false." "No," Clara agreed softly. "I do not think it was false either." She continued sorting, her fingers moving more slowly now, reluctant almost to reach the end of the bundle, and whatever difficult truth might wait within it. But near the bottom of the bundle, folded separately from the rest and sealed with a small ribbon that had long since faded from blue to gray, they found a single letter, addressed not to any recipient, but simply titled, "For whoever finds this, should I not have the courage to speak it myself." The Duke's hand hovered over it. "May I?" Clara nodded, though her heart hammered against her ribs. He broke the ribbon gently and unfolded the fragile paper, and together, they read the words her mother had left behind, unspoken for 11 long years. The letter described a night much like any other, the household quiet, the Duchess restless and troubled, having summoned Margaret to the tower room to help her compose a difficult letter, one she had refused to explain fully even to her most trusted companion. Margaret wrote of raised voices from the corridor outside, a second voice, a man's voice, cold and insistent, arguing with the Duchess about money, about the estate's finances, about decisions Eleanor apparently intended to make that would have stripped a great deal of control from someone who had long assumed he would inherit it. Margaret had hidden behind the heavy drapery of the tower room, too frightened to reveal herself, and had watched through a narrow gap as the argument grew heated, as the man seized the Duchess's arm, as Eleanor pulled away toward the window in fear rather than anger, and as, in the struggle that followed, she lost her footing and fell. The letter did not name the man directly. Margaret had written, and then crossed out, and rewritten several times, as though struggling with the weight of what she was committing to paper, before finally settling on a single line. "I fear to write his name, for he holds power over this family and over my own safety, but I pray that whoever reads this one day will understand it was not truly an accident, and that I have carried the burden of my silence every day since, not out of cowardice, but out of fear for what he threatened to do to those I love should I ever speak. Clara set the letter down with trembling hands, tears finally spilling free, not just for the truth revealed, but for the years of quiet fear her mother must have carried alone, raising a daughter in a small cottage far from Ashcombe, flinching at questions about her past, never once explaining why. The Duke's face had gone pale and still, his jaw clenched so tightly Clara could see the muscle working beneath his skin. She never wrote his name, he said quietly. Why would she not simply write his name? Perhaps she feared the letter would be found by the wrong person before it reached anyone who could act on it, Clara said. Perhaps she hoped, if it was ever discovered, that circumstance alone would point to the truth, without risking further danger to herself while she lived. Or perhaps, the Duke said, his voice hardening, she feared naming a member of my own family directly, knowing how such an accusation would be received from a servant's testimony alone, without proof. Clara understood the weight of what he was suggesting. A dead servant's unsigned accusation against a peer of the realm would carry little legal force, whatever truth it held. Whoever had been in that tower room 11 years ago had likely understood that too, and had perhaps counted on it. We need proof beyond the letter, Clara said, something that connects a name directly to that night. The Duke moved to his desk and pulled out the household ledgers once more, flipping quickly to the entries from that period. My uncle's own household records might show where he claimed to be that evening. If his account does not match what actually happened, that is a place to begin. They spent the following hours cross-referencing every record they could find, dinner invitations, travel logs, correspondence between Edmund and the estate's steward, searching for any inconsistency that might crack open the careful story that had stood unquestioned for over a decade. It was slow, frustrating work, and by the time the candles had burned low, they had found nothing definitive, only small gaps and vague accounts that proved suggestive without being conclusive. We need someone who was actually here that night, the Duke said finally, rubbing his eyes with the heel of his hand. Someone besides your mother who might have seen or heard something, even in passing. Mrs. Prentice said she was not present, Clara reminded him. No, but there were other staff here then. Some have since left service, moved on to other households, retired to the village. If we could find even one who remembers that night clearly, who saw my uncle's movements, it might be enough. It was Lady Beatrice, when consulted the next morning, who provided the name that changed everything. There was a young footman, she said, thinking hard, her spectacles pushed up onto her forehead in concentration. Henry, I believe his name was. He left service not long after Eleanor's death, took work at an inn somewhere along the coast road, if I recall correctly. He was often posted near the family's private rooms in the evenings. If anyone below stairs saw something that night besides poor Margaret, it may well have been him. The Duke wasted no time. Within the hour, a rider had been dispatched toward the coast road with instructions to locate the inn and, if the former footman could be found, to bring him back to Ashcombe Hall, quietly, and with as little attention drawn to the errand as possible. Clara spent the following days in a state of restless waiting, torn between hope that the truth might finally surface, and fear of what that truth would cost. She avoided Edmund Ashford as much as she could, though she caught his eye more than once across the dining hall, his gaze cool and assessing, as though he sensed the tide beginning to turn against him even without knowing precisely why. On the third evening, as she walked the upper corridor on her way to check on Lady Beatrice, Clara found Edmund waiting for her outside the aunt's chambers, his expression carefully composed but his eyes sharp with something colder than before. "Miss Whitmore," he said pleasantly, "you have been keeping my nephew rather occupied of late. Old ledgers, old letters, a great deal of digging through matters long settled. I did not realize my activities were of particular interest to you, sir." "Everything in this house is of interest to me," he said, his tone still mild, though something beneath it had sharpened considerably. "I have given a great deal of my life to Ashcombe's affairs. I would not like to see old, painful matters stirred up unnecessarily, causing distress to a family that has already suffered enough grief." "Grief has a way of demanding truth eventually," Clara said, holding his gaze steadily despite the unease coiling in her chest. "I do not think it can be avoided forever, however carefully one tries." Something flickered behind Edmund's pale eyes, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but Clara caught it, unmistakable now. Fear. Carefully hidden, but present all the same. "A word of caution, my dear," he said softly, stepping closer than courtesy required. "Servants who ask too many questions about matters that do not concern them have a way of finding themselves without employment, or worse. I would hate for anything unfortunate to befall a young woman so recently arrived, and so far from any family who might look after her interests. The threat, though wrapped in polite words, was unmistakable, and Clara felt a cold shiver run down her spine, even as she forced herself to hold her ground. "I have no family left to protect, Mr. Ashford," she said quietly, "which means I have very little left to lose, and a great deal of reason to see this through to its end." Edmund's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for a moment Clara thought he might say something more, something that would reveal the truth outright in a moment of anger. But he only offered a thin, humorless smile and stepped back, sweeping past her down the corridor without another word, his footsteps fading into the shadows of the great house. Clara stood alone in the dim corridor for a long moment, her heart pounding, absolutely certain now that she had struck close enough to the truth to frighten a man who had spent 11 years believing himself safe, and equally certain that a man frightened enough to threaten her openly was a man who might soon feel forced into far more dangerous action to protect the secret he had buried for so long. She did not sleep easily that night, rising twice to check that her door was properly latched, listening to every creak and settle of the old house with far greater attention than she had ever given it before. When morning finally came, gray and overcast, she found herself reluctant to leave her room at all, though duty and a stubborn refusal to be frightened into hiding eventually pulled her downstairs to face the day. She found the Duke waiting for her near the breakfast room, and something in his expression told her immediately that he had learned of the confrontation, whether from her own carefully guarded manner the previous evening, or from some other source within the household who had witnessed the exchange. "My uncle spoke with you in the upper corridor," he said quietly, drawing her aside from the other early risers gathering for breakfast. Lucy mentioned overhearing raised voices, though she could not make out the substance of it. Clara related the conversation as precisely as she could remember it, watching the Duke's expression darken with each word, his hands curling slowly into fists at his sides, though his voice remained carefully controlled. "He threatened you directly," he said when she finished, "and it was not a question." "He wrapped it carefully in courtesy," Clara said, "but yes, I believe that was his intention." "Then he will not do so again," the Duke said, his voice low and hard with a fury Clara had not yet seen from him. "I will not have anyone under my protection threatened within these walls, family or otherwise. I intend to speak with him myself, and plainly, before this goes any further." "Not yet," Clara said quickly, laying a hand on his arm before he could stride off toward whatever confrontation he was already imagining. "If you confront him now, before Henry arrives, before we have anything beyond suspicion and an old letter with no name attached, he will only grow more careful, more guarded. Let him believe himself still safe a little longer. It may be the only advantage we have." The Duke's jaw remained tight, but after a long moment he nodded, accepting the wisdom in her caution, even as every instinct in him clearly urged more immediate action. "You are remarkably steady," he said quietly, "for a woman who has just been threatened in her own place of employment." "I have very little left to be afraid of losing," Clara said simply, echoing the words she had offered Edmund the night before, though this time there was no bitterness in them, only a quiet, settled resolve. That makes courage a good deal easier to summon than you might imagine. The days before Henry Duffield's arrival passed slowly, each hour heavy with anticipation. Clara found it difficult to settle into any ordinary task, her mind circling endlessly back to the tower room, to the faded letter now locked carefully in the Duke's desk, to the low stone ledge beneath the tall arched window where a woman had lost her life 11 years before. She spent much of her time with Lady Beatrice, who seemed to sense her restlessness and made a quiet point of keeping her occupied, teaching her a complicated piece of needlework neither of them truly cared about, simply for the sake of giving her hands something steady to do. "You must learn patience in matters like these," Lady Beatrice told her one afternoon, guiding Clara's needle through a stubborn knot of thread. "Truth does not arrive on our schedule, however desperately we wish it would. It arrives on its own, in its own time, and all we can do is prepare ourselves to receive it properly when it finally comes." Clara appreciated the wisdom in the words, though she found them difficult to fully embrace. Each morning she woke half expecting news, some letter or messenger confirming that Henry Duffield could not be found, or worse, that he had died in the years since leaving service, taking whatever he knew with him into silence forever. Each evening she went to bed with the same restless questions unanswered, the household around her settling into its ordinary rhythms, while she alone, it seemed, remained suspended in uncertainty. The Duke, for his part, threw himself into estate business with unusual intensity during those days, as though the physical labor of walking his fields and reviewing his accounts might keep his mind from dwelling too long on what Henry's testimony, if it came at all, might ultimately reveal about the uncle who had raised him. Clara caught him once, standing alone at the edge of the western pasture, staring out at nothing in particular, his shoulders set with the particular stillness of a man bracing himself against a blow he could not yet see coming. She had not disturbed him in that moment, understanding instinctively that some griefs required solitude before they could be properly faced alongside another person. Henry Duffield arrived at Ashcombe Hall 3 days later, a stocky man in his middle years with weathered hands and the cautious manner of someone unused to being summoned by dukes. He stood twisting his cap between his fingers in the study, glancing nervously between Clara and the Duke as though uncertain which of them held more authority over his fate. "Your Grace," he said, bowing awkwardly, "I don't rightly know what I can offer you. It's been a long time since I served here." "I understand," the Duke said, gesturing for him to sit, though Henry seemed reluctant to take the offered chair, standing instead with his cap still clutched tightly in both hands. "I want to ask you about the night my mother died, 11 years ago, in the autumn." Henry's face went carefully blank, the practiced neutrality of a man who had spent years learning not to react. "I don't know as I remember much, Your Grace. It was a long time ago, and I was young myself then. You were posted near the family's private rooms that evening," the Duke said, "according to the household records." "Might have been," Henry admitted cautiously. Clara stepped forward gently, softening her voice the way she might have with a frightened animal. "Mr. Duffield, we do not intend you any harm. We only wish to know the truth of what happened that night. If you saw anything at all, it may help right a wrong that has gone uncorrected for far too long." Henry's eyes flicked toward her, and something in his expression shifted, a flicker of old guilt surfacing beneath the caution. "You're the one wearing the scent," he said slowly. "The one they've all been whispering about in the village already. Word travels fast, even out along the coast road." "I am," Clara said. "My mother was Margaret Coyle. She served this house before me." Henry's face changed entirely at the name, softening into something like sorrow. "Margaret," he said quietly. "I remember her well, kind girl, always had a gentle word for the younger staff, even when she'd no reason to bother with the likes of us footmen." He paused, his throat working. "I always wondered what became of her after she left so sudden like that." "She lived quietly," Clara said. "She raised me. She never spoke of this house again." Henry was silent for a long moment, staring down at the cap in his hands, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped almost to a whisper, as though he still feared being overheard even now, so many years and so many miles removed from that night. "I saw Mr. Edmund on the stairs leading up to the tower that evening," he said. "Not long before the household was roused with the news of the Duchess's fall. He looked, I don't know, disturbed, pale, hurrying, in a way I'd never seen him hurry before. I didn't think much of it at the time, not until later, when the talk started among the staff. Quiet talk, the kind you weren't meant to repeat above stairs." "What kind of talk?" the Duke asked, his voice carefully controlled despite the tension visible in his shoulders. "That the argument in the tower that night hadn't been between the Duchess and no burglar, or accident of any kind," Henry said. "That there'd been a family quarrel, over money, over the estate, over what would happen to Mr. Edmund's position once you came of age and took full control, Your Grace. Some said the Duchess meant to change matters in her will, cut certain provisions that had long favored her husband's younger brother. I don't know if that's true, I was only a footman, but I know what I saw on those stairs, and I know Miss Coyle left this house not a week later, and I know Mr. Edmund paid for her passage himself, which struck me as peculiar even then, a gentleman troubling himself over a servant's travel arrangements." The room fell into heavy silence. The Duke stood very still, his hands braced against the edge of his desk, staring down at the old ledgers spread before him as though they might rearrange themselves into some easier truth than the one now taking shape. "Would you be willing to state what you've told us formally?" the Duke asked at last, "before a magistrate, if it came to that?" Henry hesitated, clearly torn, old fear warring with old guilt. "I've a family now, Your Grace. A wife, 3 children. I'd not want to bring trouble down on them for the sake of stirring up matters long since buried." "I understand your fear," the Duke said gently, "but I promise you this, whatever protection my position can offer you and your family, you will have it, should you choose to speak the truth. My uncle has held power over the fear of good people for 11 years. I do not intend to let him hold it any longer." Henry looked between the Duke and Clara for a long moment, weighing something private in his own conscience, and finally nodded slowly. "For Margaret's sake," he said quietly. "She never deserved to carry this alone. I'll say what I know, and gladly, if it sets things right at last. After Henry had been shown to a room to rest from his long journey, Clara and the Duke remained in the study together, the weight of the footman's testimony settling heavily over them both. The Duke paced slowly before the fire, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, and Clara watched him quietly, understanding that he needed a moment to absorb the shape of what had just been confirmed before either of them spoke of next steps. I keep thinking of the boy I was, he said finally, his voice low. 15 years old, grieving my mother, and my uncle sat with me every evening for weeks, telling me it was best not to dwell on the details of the accident, that such questions would only prolong my suffering. I believed him entirely. I was grateful for his guidance. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his expression raw with a pain Clara had not yet seen him show so openly. He was not protecting me from suffering. He was protecting himself from discovery. You could not have known, Clara said gently. A boy of 15 trusts the adults who claim to love him. That is not a failing, Julian. That is simply what it means to be young and grieving, and to have no reason yet to doubt those closest to you. Perhaps, he said, though his tone remained troubled. But I have spent 11 years admiring a man who allowed my mother's death to go unanswered, who let an innocent servant carry the burden of a truth he himself created. I do not know how to reconcile the uncle I believed I knew with the man Henry has just described standing on those stairs. You do not have to reconcile them, Clara said. Perhaps they were never truly separate. Perhaps a man can love his family and still commit a terrible wrong when frightened enough. And the kindness he showed you afterward was as much an attempt to soothe his own conscience as it was genuine care for your grief. Both things can be true at once. It does not make the wrong any less real, but it may help you understand it without losing every good memory you hold of him entirely. The Duke studied her for a long moment, something in his expression softening slightly despite the weight still pressing upon him. You have a remarkable way of finding steadiness in matters that offer very little of it, he said quietly. I find myself grateful for it more than I know how to properly express. Clara felt her cheeks warm slightly at the sincerity in his voice, though she said nothing further, allowing the moment to settle between them before the practical matters of the days ahead reasserted themselves. That evening, the Duke summoned his solicitor from the nearby town, a careful, precise man named Mr. Colby who listened to the accumulated evidence, the letter, the ledger discrepancies, Henry's testimony, with the grave attention of a man well used to weighing difficult truths. When he finished reviewing everything laid before him, he sat back in his chair and folded his hands together thoughtfully. It is not, I must caution you, conclusive proof of wrongdoing, he said. A letter without a named accusation, a footman's memory of a troubled expression on a staircase, financial motive inferred from estate records. A skilled advocate could argue any of it away individually. But together, Your Grace, it paints a picture strong enough to warrant a formal inquiry, particularly given your standing to request one. Then I will request one, the Duke said without hesitation. Word of the impending inquiry could not be kept entirely quiet, not with a solicitor summoned and departed, and a former footman lodged overnight in the servants' quarters. By the following morning, the tension in the house had grown thick enough to feel, every servant moving carefully, speaking in hushed tones, casting wary glances toward the family wing whenever Edmund Ashford passed through the halls. Edmund himself seemed to sense the shifting ground beneath him. Clara noticed it in the stiffness of his posture at breakfast, the way his hand trembled slightly as he lifted his teacup, the too careful politeness of his conversation with Lady Beatrice, a man performing normalcy while something desperate churned beneath the surface. That afternoon he requested a private audience with the Duke, and Clara, passing the study door sometime later, could not help but pause when she heard raised voices from within. Edmund's tone stripped now of all its earlier smoothness, sharp and pleading in a way she had not expected from him. You would believe the word of a dismissed servant and a frightened footman over your own family, Edmund's voice carried through the heavy door, taut with barely controlled panic. I raised you, Julian, after your father died. I taught you everything you know of running this estate. Have I not earned some measure of trust after all these years? You earned my trust, the Duke's voice replied, low and hard, by pretending grief you did not feel, by steering me away from questions I should have asked 11 years ago, by allowing me to believe my mother's death was a simple accident, while you knew the truth of what actually happened in that tower. I did what was necessary, Edmund said, his voice cracking now, all pretense abandoned. Your mother meant to strip away everything I had built here, everything I had spent my life securing for this family's future. She would have left me with nothing, cast aside on a whim, after everything I had sacrificed for Ashcombe. I never meant for her to fall, I swear it. It was an accident, born of an argument that went too far, nothing more. Clara's breath caught in her throat. There it was, at last, the confession neither of them had dared hope would come so directly, spoken in a moment of desperate weakness behind a door that had not been properly shut. An accident you then spent 11 years concealing, the Duke said, his voice shaking now with barely restrained fury. At the cost of an innocent woman's peace, forced from her home, forced to raise her daughter under the shadow of a threat she never dared speak aloud, forced to die without ever clearing her own name. I did what I had to do to protect this family, Edmund said, though the words now sounded hollow even to Clara's ears, the desperate justification of a man who had convinced himself of his own righteousness for far too long to abandon it easily. I protected you, Julian. I protected the Ashcombe name. You protected yourself, the Duke said, and called it protection of something greater to ease your own conscience. That ends today. There was a heavy silence, and then the sound of the study door being thrown open. Clara stepped back quickly, though not quickly enough to avoid Edmund's gaze as he strode out, his face pale and stricken, his composure entirely shattered. He stopped when he saw her standing there, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. You, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper, stripped of all its earlier menace. You and your mother's ghost, come back to ruin everything I built. My mother built nothing that needed ruining, Mr. Ashford, Clara said quietly, though her heart pounded fiercely in her chest. She only ever wanted to be free to tell the truth. You took that from her. I am simply giving it back. Edmund stared at her a moment longer, something breaking visibly behind his eyes, and then he turned and walked away down the corridor without another word, his footsteps unsteady in a way Clara had never heard from him before, a man finally facing the collapse of a secret he had spent more than a decade believing safely buried. The Duke appeared in the study doorway a moment later, his face pale but resolute, and when his eyes met Clara's, she saw in them not triumph, but a deep, exhausted grief, finally allowed to surface after 11 long years of being held carefully at bay. He confessed, the Duke said quietly. Not to a magistrate, not yet, but he confessed. I heard, Clara said softly. It does not undo what was done, he said. It does not bring my mother back, or give your mother back the years of fear she should never have had to carry. But it is the truth, finally spoken, after all this time. He drew a slow breath, steadying himself. That has to count for something. It counts for everything, Clara said gently, and reached out, almost without thinking, to take his hand. He did not pull away. The formal inquiry took place 3 weeks later, conducted quietly at the magistrate's request, out of deference to the family's standing, though word of it had already begun to travel through the county despite every effort at discretion. Henry Duffield gave his account with steady, careful honesty, his earlier fear replaced now by a quiet determination to see the matter finally set right. Mr. Colby presented the letter, the ledger discrepancies, the pattern of payments that had never quite made sense until laid out together in their entirety. Lady Beatrice attended the proceedings as well, seated with rigid dignity beside her nephew, her sharp eyes fixed unwaveringly on Edmund throughout the entire hearing, as though her steady gaze alone might compel him toward honesty. When the magistrate called upon her briefly to confirm what she remembered of the rumors that had circulated among the staff 11 years earlier, she answered with the same clear, unflinching directness she had shown Clara from their very first meeting, refusing to soften or hedge her recollection, despite the discomfort evident on Edmund's face at each new detail she confirmed. Mrs. Prentice, too, was called to speak, her voice trembling at first but growing steadier as she described what she had witnessed in the garden all those years ago, the purse pressed into Margaret's hand, the tears, the hurried departure that followed within the week. She would not meet Edmund's eyes as she spoke, though Clara, watching closely from her seat beside the Duke, saw the older woman's hands finally unclench in her lap once her testimony was complete, as though a weight she had carried silently for over a decade had at last been set down. Clara herself was asked to present the letter, and she did so with steady hands, reading her mother's careful, faded words aloud to the room, her voice catching only once, at the line describing Margaret's fear for those she loved. She did not look at Edmund as she read. She did not need to. She could feel the weight of his gaze upon her the entire time, and when she finally raised her eyes to the magistrate instead, she felt, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Hall, that her mother's voice was finally being heard exactly as it deserved to be heard, without fear, without interruption, without the threat of consequence hanging over every word. Edmund Ashford, faced with the accumulated weight of evidence and his own earlier admission, overheard by more than Clara alone that afternoon, offered no further denial. He confessed formally to the argument in the tower, to the struggle that had ended in his sister-in-law's fatal fall, to the desperate cover-up that followed, the payments made to ensure Margaret Coyle's silence, the careful management of a household narrative that had held firm for 11 long years. He insisted, until the very end, that he had never meant for Eleanor to die, that the fall had been a terrible accident born of a heated moment rather than deliberate harm, and the magistrate, weighing the evidence available, ultimately accepted that the death itself had not been intentional, though the concealment that followed carried its own severe consequences. Edmund was stripped of his position within the estate's affairs entirely, banished from Ashcombe Hall and from any future involvement in the family's holdings, his reputation among the county's gentry irreparably damaged by the scandal that followed, whispered about at every dinner table and every social gathering for months afterward. On the morning of his departure, Clara happened to be crossing the entrance hall when his carriage was being loaded, and their eyes met briefly across the wide marble floor where this entire affair had first begun, with a single startled question about a scent she had never known the significance of. He did not speak to her, nor she to him, but something passed between them in that silent exchange, an acknowledgement, perhaps, that whatever animosity had grown between them over the preceding weeks, the truth that had finally surfaced was larger than either of their personal grievances, older and heavier than either of them had fully understood when they first crossed paths. He climbed into his carriage without a backward glance at the house that had been his home for so many decades, and the wheels crunched slowly down the long gravel drive, carrying him away from Ashcombe Hall for what would prove to be the final time. Mr. Colby remarked afterward that such quiet, informal resolutions were not uncommon in matters involving families of standing, where the full weight of formal punishment often gave way, in practice, to the softer but no less permanent sentence of social exile and disgrace. The Duke had considered pressing for harsher legal consequence, and spent long hours in private conversation with Clara weighing the matter carefully, but in the end, weighing the additional pain further proceedings would cause to Lady Beatrice, and the certainty that Edmund's ruin was already complete in every practical sense, he allowed the matter to rest as the magistrate had determined it, satisfied that the truth itself, finally spoken openly after so long, was justice enough for what could be recovered of the past. He left the county quietly within a fortnight, and Clara never saw him again, though she often wondered, in quieter moments, whether he ever came to understand fully the weight of what his desperate cover-up had cost the people around him, or whether he continued, even in exile, to believe himself somehow justified. For the Duke, the resolution brought a complicated mixture of relief and fresh grief, the truth finally surfacing after so many years, bringing with it not only answers but a fresh wave of mourning for the mother he had lost so young, and for the uncle he had trusted so completely, both taken from him in different ways by the same terrible night. He spent several quiet weeks afterward walking the estate alone in the early mornings, before the household had fully risen, as though needing the solitude to properly grieve what could not be undone even now that the truth was known. Clara did not press him during this time, understanding instinctively that some sorrows required space rather than company, though she made certain he knew, through small gestures, a cup of tea left waiting in the study, a quiet word of comfort offered in passing, that she remained near whenever he was ready to lean on her. Slowly, over the following month, she watched him begin to soften, the tightness that had gripped his shoulders since her very first day at Ashcombe easing bit by bit, replaced gradually by something lighter, a man finally permitted to mourn properly rather than carry the additional burden of unanswered questions alongside his grief. He began speaking of his mother more freely, sharing small memories with Clara over quiet evenings in the study, memories that had clearly been locked away for years behind the careful, guarded composure he had shown the world since her death. "I had forgotten how much I loved to hear her laugh," he confessed one evening, staring into the fire with a faint, wondering smile. "It has been so long since I allowed myself to remember the good years properly, rather than only the ending. I find I am grateful to you for that as well, Clara, though I do not think you set out to give it to me." "I did not," Clara admitted, "but I am glad all the same, if it has brought you some measure of peace." In the days immediately following the hearing, the household at Ashcombe Hall seemed to exhale as one, the tension that had gripped every corridor and every quiet conversation for weeks, finally loosening its hold. Servants who had spoken to Clara only in careful, guarded tones now greeted her warmly in the halls, several of the older staff approaching her privately to share their own small memories of Margaret Coyle, fragments of kindness and laughter that painted an even fuller picture of the mother Clara had never fully known. Lucy, in particular, sought her out one afternoon in the linen room, her earlier caution replaced entirely by open, unreserved friendliness. My mother always said your mother had the gentlest hands of anyone in service, she told Clara, folding a stack of pillowcases with careful attention. Said she could calm a crying child faster than any nurse in the county. I wish I could have known her properly, rather than just hearing stories. I wish that too, Clara admitted, and found, to her surprise, that the ache of that wish had softened considerably since arriving at Ashcombe, replaced by a quiet gratitude for every new fragment of her mother's history she continued to uncover. For Clara, the aftermath brought something she had not expected. In the household's eyes, and soon in the county's wider awareness, her mother's name was finally restored to what it should always have been, that of a loyal, devoted young woman who had witnessed a terrible tragedy and carried its burden alone, rather than betray the safety of those she loved, rather than risk the threats made against her. The Duke insisted on a small memorial plaque placed in the Ashcombe Hall chapel, bearing Margaret Coyle's name alongside a brief inscription honoring her years of faithful service and her enduring courage, a quiet, permanent acknowledgement of a truth too long denied. He consulted Clara carefully on the exact wording, unwilling to commission anything without her full approval, and the two of them spent a quiet evening together in the study drafting and redrafting the inscription, until it finally felt right to them both, simple and honest, free of the flourishes so often carved onto memorials for people who had never truly been known by those who mourned them. In loving memory of Margaret Coyle, the Duke read aloud from the final draft, who served this house with unwavering devotion, and who carried a burden of silence not out of weakness, but out of love, for those she sought to protect. Her courage is remembered now, as it should always have been. He looked up at Clara across the desk. Is that enough, do you think? Is it right? Clara felt tears gather unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. It is more than enough, she said softly. It is everything she deserved to hear, though she never lived to hear it. The plaque was commissioned from a craftsman in the county town, and installed within a fortnight, small and unassuming against the chapel's ancient stone wall, yet carrying a weight far beyond its modest size. She deserved better than silence, the Duke said, standing beside Clara in the chapel the day the plaque was unveiled, both of them looking up at the simple bronze marker catching the afternoon light through the stained glass windows above. I only wish I could have known it sooner, so she might have lived to see her name cleared while she still walked this earth. She would have been glad simply to know it happened at all, Clara said softly, her fingers brushing lightly against the cool bronze letters of her mother's name. She spent so many years believing the truth would never surface. I think, wherever she is now, she is finally at peace. In the weeks that followed, as the household slowly settled back into its ordinary rhythms, Clara found herself spending increasing amounts of time in the Duke's company, no longer summoned for investigations or urgent revelations, but simply drawn together by the shared weight of everything they had uncovered, and by something else neither of them had quite named aloud yet, something that had grown quietly alongside the unraveling mystery, patient and steady, waiting for its own moment to surface. It was Lady Beatrice, sharp-eyed as ever despite her age, who finally spoke the truth neither of the younger pair seemed willing to acknowledge. "You two spend a great deal of time together for a duke and his aunt's companion," she observed one evening over tea, her eyes glinting with amusement above the rim of her cup. "I do wonder what the neighbors will make of it eventually." Clara felt her cheeks warm, glancing quickly toward the Duke, who seemed equally caught off guard by his aunt's directness, though he did not deny the observation as quickly as Clara might have expected. "Miss Whitmore has become an important part of this household," he said carefully, though something in his tone suggested there was far more beneath the careful words than he was willing to admit openly. At least not yet. Not in front of his sharp-eyed aunt. Lady Beatrice merely smiled knowingly and returned to her tea, saying nothing further, though the look she exchanged with Clara across the room carried volumes neither of them needed to speak aloud. That evening, walking together through the gardens as the sun set low and golden over Ashcombe Hall, the Duke stopped beneath the same window where his mother had once fallen, now finally at peace with its history rather than haunted by it, and turned to face Clara directly. "I have thought a great deal these past weeks about how strange it was that you arrived wearing my mother's scent," he said quietly. "At first I believed it a cruel trick of fate, or worse, some deliberate deception. Now I wonder if it was something closer to a gift, a thread pulling me toward a truth I might never have found otherwise, and toward someone I do not believe I was meant to simply let walk back out of this house once the mystery was resolved." Clara's heart quickened at his words, at the careful vulnerability in his voice, so different from the guarded, suspicious man who had confronted her in the entrance hall all those weeks before. "I did not come here seeking anything beyond quiet employment," she said softly. I certainly never imagined finding my mother's story or anything else within these walls. And yet you found both, the Duke said, stepping closer, his eyes searching hers in the fading light. I find myself deeply grateful for it, Clara, more grateful than I know how to properly express. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the simple intimacy of it settled warmly in her chest, chasing away the last lingering chill of everything they had uncovered together. She did not step back as he reached for her hand, and standing there beneath the tower window, in the golden light of a garden finally free of old secrets, Clara felt, for the first time since arriving at Ashcombe Hall, that she had truly come home. Winter came early to Ashcombe that year, dusting the long gravel drive with a fine layer of frost, and the household, once so heavy with old grief and buried secrets, had settled into a warmth Clara had not thought possible when she first arrived, shivering and confused, wearing a scent that did not belong to her. She remained at Ashcombe Hall through the changing seasons, no longer merely a companion to Lady Beatrice, though she continued that role with genuine affection, but as someone woven fully into the fabric of the household itself. Mrs. Prentice, freed at last from the fear that had shadowed her for over a decade, had grown noticeably lighter in her manner, humming softly as she went about her duties, occasionally sharing small fond memories of Eleanor Ashford with Clara, over quiet cups of tea in the housekeeper's private parlor, memories she had kept locked away for years, afraid to speak them aloud. Henry Duffield returned to his coastal inn with a small pension granted by the Duke in gratitude for his courage, and word reached Ashcombe some months later that he had used part of it to expand his modest establishment, naming a newly added guest room, rather sentimentally, after a duchess he had known only briefly but had never forgotten. Lady Beatrice, though her health remained delicate through the winter months, seemed to gain a renewed vigor from the household's lightened spirit, insisting on attending every small gathering, and taking a keen, often meddling interest in the growing closeness between her nephew and his aunt's companion, an interest she made no effort whatsoever to disguise. She took to inviting Clara for long afternoon conversations by the fire, sharing stories of Eleanor Ashford that had nothing to do with tragedy or secrecy at all, simply the ordinary, warm memories of a sister-in-law she had loved dearly, her laugh, her fondness for a particular garden bench, the way she used to hum old country songs while arranging flowers for the dinner table. "I am glad," Lady Beatrice said one such afternoon, setting down her teacup with deliberate care, "that Eleanor's memory has finally been allowed to settle into something gentler than grief. For too many years this house treated her death as a wound to be avoided, rather than a life to be remembered properly. You have given us that back, my dear, whether you intended to or not." Clara found herself unexpectedly moved by the observation, understanding for the first time the full scope of what had changed within Ashcombe Hall since her arrival, not only the resolution of a long-buried crime, but the quiet restoration of two women's memories, Eleanor's and her own mother's, both finally permitted to be spoken of with warmth rather than careful, fearful silence. Of Edmund Ashford, little was heard. A distant relation mentioned once, in passing conversation, that he had taken up quiet residence somewhere in the north, living modestly, avoiding society almost entirely. The Duke did not seek him out, nor did he wish to. Some truths, once spoken and answered for, required no further pursuit. In early spring, before the proposal that would change the course of her life so completely, Clara traveled with Julian to the small coastal village where Henry Duffield kept his inn, wishing to thank him properly for the courage he had shown in coming forward. Henry greeted them warmly, proudly showing off the newly named guest room, its modest plaque above the door reading simply the Eleanor room, and insisting they stay for supper before continuing their journey. Over the meal, Henry's wife, a cheerful, round-faced woman named Grace, spoke fondly of how her husband had changed in the months since his testimony, sleeping easier, laughing more freely, no longer carrying the quiet weight he had borne for over a decade without ever explaining its source to her. He would wake sometimes in the night, she confided to Clara as the men talked quietly by the fire, troubled by something he never would name. "I am glad, whatever it was, that it has finally been set right. A man should not have to carry such things alone." Clara found herself deeply moved by the observation, understanding now more fully than ever how far the ripples of that single night in the tower had spread, touching lives far beyond the walls of Ashcombe Hall itself, and how much healing had followed in the wake of the truth finally being spoken. They returned to Ashcombe 2 days later, the journey passing easily in comfortable conversation, and Clara felt, watching the familiar towers of the great house rise into view against the darkening sky, a settled certainty that she had indeed found her true home, not merely in the grand halls of the estate, but in the quiet, steady company of the man riding beside her. Clara often found herself standing before the small bronze plaque in the chapel, especially in quiet moments when the weight of the past year settled softly over her, tracing her mother's name with gentle fingers, feeling not sorrow any longer, but a deep, settled gratitude. Margaret Coyle's story had ended not in fear and silence, as it so nearly had, but in truth, honored openly at last, within the very walls that had once demanded her silence. The Duke proposed to her on a crisp morning in early spring, in the garden beneath the tower window where they had first spoken so honestly of what had grown between them, the frost finally melting from the grass, new green shoots pushing up through the softened earth in quiet, stubborn defiance of the long winter behind them. Clara said yes before he had even fully finished the question, laughing through sudden tears, and Lady Beatrice, watching from a nearby window with undisguised satisfaction, declared to anyone within earshot that she had known it would happen from the very first week, though she took full credit for having said nothing to rush it along. The months leading up to the wedding passed in a warm blur of preparation, the household throwing itself into the occasion with an enthusiasm that spoke to how deeply the staff had come to care for Clara during her time at Ashcombe. Mrs. Prentice took personal charge of overseeing every detail, from the flowers to be gathered from the very gardens where Julian had first spoken so openly of his feelings, to the small favors to be distributed among the guests, insisting that nothing be left to chance for a wedding she considered, in her own quiet way, to be a long overdue correction to the sorrow this house had carried for over a decade. Lucy, now grown confident and cheerful in Clara's company, was given the honor of helping prepare the wedding gown, a task she approached with such careful pride that Clara found herself deeply moved by the young maid's evident joy on her behalf. Henry Duffield rode ahead to confirm his attendance, adding in his careful, uneven hand that he would not have missed the occasion for anything in the world, and that Margaret would have been prouder than words could say to see her daughter so happily settled at last. Even Lady Beatrice, despite her frail health, insisted on personally selecting the flowers for the chapel, declaring that no one else in the household had a proper eye for such matters, and spent several contented afternoons in the greenhouse with Clara, discussing which blooms would best complement the season and the occasion. Her sharp tongue softened during those hours into something closer to genuine tenderness. Their wedding took place that summer, a quiet, joyful affair attended by the full household staff, by Lady Beatrice glowing with pride in the front pew, by Mrs. Prentice weeping openly with happiness throughout the entire ceremony, and by Henry Duffield, who had traveled from the coast specially for the occasion, standing respectfully near the back of the chapel with his cap held carefully against his chest. On the morning of the wedding, as Clara prepared in the same tower room that had once held so much sorrow, now transformed with fresh flowers and warm sunlight streaming through the tall arched window, she found a small wrapped parcel waiting on the writing desk, left there by the Duke with a short note in his familiar hand. I asked the perfumer to study the old formula found in the ledgers and recreate it as faithfully as possible, the note read. Not because I wish for you to wear my mother's scent any longer, borrowed and uncertain, but because I wish for you to have a fragrance entirely your own, made freely, chosen freely, belonging only to you, exactly as you belong here, fully and completely as yourself. Inside the parcel, Clara found a small crystal bottle filled with a new fragrance, similar in its warmth to the one she had worn that very first day, but subtly different, brighter somehow, blended fresh rather than inherited from grief and secrecy. She dabbed a small amount onto her wrist, breathing in the new scent slowly, and felt, for the first time in her life, that she was stepping forward not as her mother's shadow, not as a stranger carrying an unexplained mystery, but simply and entirely as herself, chosen, known, and deeply loved. She descended the tower staircase that morning toward her waiting future, the old fears of the house finally laid fully to rest behind her, and stepped out into the bright summer sunlight of the garden, where Julian stood waiting, his face breaking into the warmest smile she had ever seen from him, a man no longer haunted by unanswered questions, but standing instead in the clear, settled peace of truth finally spoken, and love finally found. The scent that had once caused such alarm in the entrance hall of Ashcombe now lingered gently in the summer air between them, no longer a mystery to be solved, but simply, quietly, a beginning.